All right, the first step in talking about formalism is we're going to approach it by discussing matters of genre. Genre is actually an entire subcategory of literary criticism. People spend their entire careers focusing on genre studies. We're going to take a pretty broad approach to it, and those who find genre studies particularly interesting might be annoyed at how simplified I'm making this, but um, let's take a look at this. First of all, in the last video, I talked about Paulson's comments on the creation of Brian's books. There's a lot of emphasis placed on the realism of the scenario and Brian's survival techniques. Paulson wanted to make it as real as possible. So let's talk about literary realism. Realism in literary terms means that there's an attempt to recreate the appearance of life as it is actually experienced. This means an author makes an attempt at verisimilitude, speaking dialogue, which we might hear in our daily lives, bringing focus to commonplace events like work, love, marriage, children, death. However, realism can also mean something that is trying to capture the reality of a possible situation, a hypothetical situation, without the ease of fantastic or supernatural elements or resolutions. Now, if we take a step back and think about realism as a literary movement, this began in the late 19th century as a response to the Romantic movement, which was a literary field that focused on high adventure, stories of extraordinary people and events, and often had elements of action, romance, and mystery, and for the most part had happy endings. Realists felt that romance offered only pure escapism and sought to hold up a mirror to the real world and its hardships. A romantic counterpoint to Hatchet, for instance, would be something like Tarzan of the Apes, which was written by Edgar Rice Burroughs and was originally published in 1912. This was a novel that falls into the crossover texts categories, stories not written for children but often enjoyed and read by them. Must be why Disney found that appealing for an animated adaptation. But Tarzan tells the story of a wealthy family shipwrecked on an isolated coast in Africa. They gave birth to a boy who would be raised in the jungle by apes and would become the greatest warrior in the tribe, taming the wilderness as his own domain. Oh, in the end, Tarzan found another group of shipwreck survivors, falls in love with an English woman who takes him back to civilization, only to find that he was actually ready to inherit a huge fortune and estate. Unrealistic, certainly, but still quite exciting. Hatchet can also be considered, like Tarzan, a Robinsonade, which is a genre of fiction about being shipwrecked on an island or lost in an isolated wilderness and left to fend for yourself. Robinsonades are given that name by Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, which was published in 1719, another novel we previously mentioned as a popular crossover work. Robinsonades are typically focused on a human's power of achievement. The protagonist will work their way through crude technology, survivalist methods, and rebuilding some semblance of comfort or civilization. And they're also often placing humans against the hostility of nature, especially when trying to prove man's dominance. Does this sound familiar to you while reading Hatchet? Some other key examples of Robinsonades in children's fiction that we may want to bring up. Number one, Swiss Family Robinson by Johann David Weiss, published in 1812. The Jungle Book by Rudyard Kipling in 1894. The Black Stallion by Walter Farley in 1941. Lord of the Flies, William Golding in 1954. And Island of the Blue Dolphins by Scott Odell, which was published in 1960. As you can see, it's quite a popular genre among young people, and it has maintained popularity into the 20th century. We should take this opportunity to show how Hatchet and other realist novels look compared to other literary genres. Professor Kip Wheeler of Carson Newman University defines fantasy as, quote, any literature that is removed from reality, especially poems, books, or short narratives set in non-existent worlds. The characters are often something other than humans, or human characters may interact with non-human characters like trolls, dragons, Wookiees, etc., etc. But there's also another level of fantasy, referred to as magical realism, wherein the world presented is mostly realistic, with fantastical elements. Oftentimes, these stories depict characters reacting to these fantastic elements as if they were normal. Think of Pirates of the Caribbean, The Curse of the Black Pearl, a decent attempt at piratical romance, but then there's also the element of the ghost story layered on top of it. Now, this is a different level of fantasy than, say, Star Wars, which takes place a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away, conveniently in one that does not, to our knowledge, exist. So, as a result of these varying levels of realism, there is formed a spectrum from most realistic to least realistic, where on the realistic side, with realism, there's an attempt at verisimilitude, there's focuses on the mundane or the everyday experiences of real people, not always a happy ending, and tries to present things as they would really happen. Then up the scale, we have romance, heightened reality, extraordinary events, high adventure, romance, and unlikely, but not necessarily impossible events. It's still based in the real world, just made more exciting. Then we have magical realism, which is fiction set mostly in the real world with one or two impossible, supernatural, or fantastical elements layered on top. The real world, as we know it, interacts easily with the fantastic. And then at the very end of that spectrum, you have full fantasy, totally removed from the real world, governed by its own rules. Humans and non humans interact with one another, and events are usually impossible given our own world's governing rules. Now, again, the spectrum model is simplified, and genre theorists would probably be pretty annoyed at me for oversimplifying it, but it does allow us to see that a book doesn't have to fit fully into a box. Certainly, Hatchet attempts a great deal of verisimilitude, but you can see from the response to the ending in Brian's Winter that there are still certainly coincidences and good fortune that place the text within a slight lean towards romance. But we'll leave that perhaps for the discussion board to see your response. Do you feel like Hatchet is a realistic novel? Do you feel like it's overly simplified, or some of the conveniences overly contrived? Talk about it on the discussion board, and we'll speak to more areas of formalism in the next video.